Hi, it's Kaylee. February 22nd is the start of the National Eating Disorder Association week, which is a week that has been on my radar for as long as they've been having a week to kind of spread information and outreach and get support to people who are suffering from eating disorders and disordered eating. And I've never spoken up during this week in the past because honestly, I've been too shy to, and it's scary. It's very intimidating to talk about a problem that's as complicated as disordered eating. But this year, I feel like I have a tiny bit more bandwidth. My recovery is stronger than it's honestly ever been. And so I feel like the least I can do is share just a little bit of my perspective and my experience. The thing that stands out the most to me when I'm talking with people about disordered eating, especially people who don't struggle with disordered eating themselves, or even people who do but haven't maybe been around the treatment world for a couple decades plus, like myself, is that there's a lack of understanding around the complexity of this disorder. So this is, if you're watching this, is probably going to be a longer video. I've used the word complex like at least twice already, and we're not even 2 minutes in. So that should be a heads up that this is a bit longer of a conversation. I do want to keep it as concise as possible and not overcomplicate it. But one of the myths that's really problematic with disordered eating is that it's based on vanity and an obsession with a particular body size or a particular body aesthetic. And while this can be a piece of an eating disorder, and it can even be part of the etiology, like the thing that triggers an eating disorder for some people, for many people actually, is dieting and intentional weight loss in the first place. But it's so much more complicated than that, and I want to explain why. There's one word that I heard a few years ago, and like all of these light bulbs went off. When I first went into treatment for disordered eating, there was a lot of conversation around how this was a mental health issue, but it was also a physical issue, like a biological thing. Like there was a genetic component, and obviously with energy intake being less than what one needs, or with the net energy that an individual is getting being less than what they need, and the instances of like over-exercising, there's definitely a biological principle at play. Huge piece, arguably one of three main pieces. So the other one that everybody seemed to acknowledge pretty readily was the psychological piece, the mental health component. This is things like coping skills and family dynamics, personality can be a piece of it, but just mental health overall and self-esteem. A tendency toward depression or anxiety could be really overlapping. Like you'll see this very common in people with disordered eating may also have severe anxiety or depression or obsessive compulsive disorders or other mood disorders. So there's definitely a psychological piece, and this is where the behavioral element comes in. So there's some important language around like body size not being a behavior, and especially in eating disorder treatment, somebody's disorder or disease status is not more or less severe depending on their body size. And this is hard for some people to get their heads wrapped around because we're conditioned to see usually a very thin white woman or thin white adolescent as the kind of prototype or quintessential eating disorder sufferer. And that's not always wrong, but it's actually a really small percentage of people with disordered eating who fit that physical stereotype. So there's a term in the DSM, atypical anorexia, which is used to diagnose somebody who has anorexic behaviors but has a BMI that's higher than I want to say it's something outrageous. It's either like 17.5 or 18.5, something very low. And the reality is the majority of people who have anorexic behaviors don't live in a body that is that small. They live in larger bodies. And that doesn't mean that their disorder is less dangerous or less extreme. This is where we go back to the biological piece, right? There's a genetic component to your body shape, just like there's a genetic component to your height or any other physical characteristic. Some people have like wide set eyes. Some people have ears that are higher up or lower up. I happen to have, all kinds of little structural anomalies that are unique to me that aren't pathological. There's not one ideal body size. The ideal body size is totally arbitrary, which gets me to the third part, which is the sociological component of this disorder. So the word that I don't know if I even mentioned, I'm talking about something that's a little awkward for me still, but the word is biopsychosocial. So this is a model that explains a health phenomenon, or I guess it could be a health phenomenon. It explains the well-being of an individual based on not just their genetics, although that's about a third, right? The biology, the psychological component, things like, again, I mentioned coping skills, maybe if there's trauma history, which quite frankly, all of us have some trauma history. If we get to a certain age in this world, it's hard not to. Again, pointing me right back to that third piece of this puzzle, which is the social component. So the social component is going to be cultural things like that arbitrary thin ideal, or this cultural kind of moralization of body sizes. And this hurts everybody. This hurts people in straight sizes, which are people who wear not plus size clothing. This hurts people in very small bodies. This hurts people in bodies that are disabled. This hurts people in bodies that have different skin colors. This hurts people in larger bodies when we're talking about eating disorders, because their experiences can become erased. Weight stigma is a whole nother huge topic. I think I've touched on it really briefly in one or two past posts or videos, but this idea that you can diagnose someone's health by looking at them and deciding if their weight range represents wellness or disease. And I can tell you, walking into a doctor's office for decades, being in a body size that society thought was healthy, I have been right on death's door numerous times, like in the emergency room getting intravenous fluids because I'm so malnourished that my body's just barely hanging in there. But because I showed up in a thin body and I wasn't emaciated, my eating disorder wasn't necessarily acknowledged or questioned. No one asked me about how much I was eating or exercising. It's frustrating, to say the least. And this is somebody speaking with a lot of privilege. I can only imagine how much more painful that is to go into a doctor's office in a larger body and have your complaints completely minimized or blamed entirely on your body size. And we know from research that this has happened in a really harmful way, to the point where people avoid seeing the doctor because they don't want to be told to lose weight when they have a cold or when they have a hurt wrist or whatever it is, whatever ailment, stomach ache. It's really commonplace that people go to the doctor and with a complaint, and instead of having tests run, they're told to lose weight. This has happened to friends of mine, to loved ones of mine, and it's not okay. And it's part of that third component of disordered eating, which I think pushes people who are trying to find recovery back into the disorder. So this was one of the places where I feel like I got stuck for decades, because every time I would start to find recovery, my body would start to become larger. And because of my internalized weight stigma and cultural conditioning, and because of the not even internalized, but just experience of living in a larger body, and the belief systems that we grow up in and develop like programming around, I thought that I was doing something wrong and that I was becoming less healthy, even as I was becoming healthy for like the first time. So that's really what I wanted to touch on today. The fact that disordered eating exists not in a vacuum. It's like almost every disease. It's very rarely just one puzzle piece that can explain it all. So to reiterate, you have the biological components, and these are things that are sometimes outside of anyone's control, right? Your genes are what they are. But another kind of biological component would arguably be your intake and your output of energy. And so if you do have some control over that, making sure that you're nourishing yourself adequately enough and not killing yourself working out, trying to burn off calories. Energy is a good thing. It's necessary for our survival. Psychological stuff like mental health, which we can do a little bit. Maybe there's like some ability to slide around in terms of how well you are mentally. Everybody knows getting enough sleep, stress reduction techniques. I teach yoga. Reach out if you want some links to some free classes, or if you need some ideas for resources. If yoga is not your thing, therapy, other coping skills, working on like a sense of inherent worthiness has been really huge for me. So finding value outside of what I look like has been important, but also challenging because our culture is insistent upon our value being so linked to what we look like. So that's where the third piece comes in. And whether you suffer or not with disordered eating, your relationship with your body, your relationship with food, one thing that everyone can do is start to question our culture and the layers of oppression that we just assume are natural or fine or unavoidable, because they are avoidable. Fat phobia is violence. Just like sexism is violence, just like racism is violence. And so examining, the beliefs that you hold, and if you have the bandwidth, doing some education to relearn some of these false ideas about health, and even to let go of the idea of health being like a moral requisite. Health is not within our control entirely. Obviously, there are choices that we may or may not be able to make. Again, this is a measure of how much privilege you have. It's really hard to get a good night's sleep if you're struggling working, night shifts trying to pay your bills. So there's definitely, again, a lot of nuance and complexity in this conversation, but I think that this is really important food for thought. It helped me a lot in my recovery to realize that there's three pieces kind of moving around. And whenever I feel stuck now in this process, I figure out where I can best spend some energy. So maybe it is on the biological piece and feeding myself enough. Maybe it's more on the psychological piece and doing some work to fortify my own mental well-being. And then this past year, really the past 12 months, a lot of my work that's really propelled me forward, that's given me a lot of drive to work on this, has been looking at the sociological piece and these different intersections of oppression that we experience based on our identity, and how this is tricky to say. Not challenging my eating disorder felt kind of like being complicit in weight stigma, in that cultural kind of element. And that's not at all a judgment on somebody who is unable to challenge their eating disorder. This is just something that motivated me. I don't personally value thin bodies more than bigger bodies, and I have enough safety and security to exist in the world at whatever size my body naturally wants to be in. Not saying that's an easy mental hurdle to get over, but I am saying that for me, that felt like a way to honor the cultural, the sociological component of this, and be a part of a cultural shift that I really hope to see happening. Can't talk about that without then revisiting the other pieces. So again, like dealing with the cultural piece, if you have underlying trauma that you haven't been able to work through or get some support around, that's going to be just exhausting, and it may not be possible, right? So all of these pieces kind of are moving parts, and it's just nice to know that you're not stuck. If one of them isn't going to budge, there's another kind of inroad. And it's nice to know if you are living in this world and you care about people who struggle with disordered eating, there are things that you can do that aren't even necessarily connected to that one individual. They're more connected to your own worldview and your ability to get curious about the beliefs that you hold about bodies and body sizes and food. I always think to myself, I should think of what I want to wrap it up and end on, but so that there's some sort of cohesive conclusion here. I'll repeat that word again, biopsychosocial. And just know that if you or a loved one are struggling with your body or food or the world, you are so far from alone. And I just have so much compassion for anyone going through any of this. I am open to talk with anyone anytime about all of this stuff. So reach out if you need a little support. And if you're celebrating National Eating Disorder Association Week, the theme that they've chosen is very much aligned with the sociological piece that everybody has a seat on the table. People in marginalized bodies, whether they're a marginalized gender, marginalized ethnicity, marginalized body size, tend to be erased a little bit in this field, if you will. Again, it's a lot of people who look like yours truly here that get the representation. So another thing that you can do is seek out voices of people who don't look like me. If you're watching this, thanks. But also reach out if you want some ideas for contacts on places like Instagram or in kind of the world of literature. I know somebody who's been hugely helpful for me lately is Sonia Renee Taylor. Her book, The Body Is Not an Apology, was very moving for me. So check that out and reach out if you need more resources or just to chat. All right, take care.